All right. Hello again, everybody. It is another beautiful day here in Tennessee, and we are going to be talking about virtue ethics. Okay, so here's our map, right, that we were looking at last time. We've been talking about ethics that's focused on actions, and we've looked at the outcomes of actions, and we focused on rules, the actions themselves, right? And so today we're shifting our focus from actions to people and to character. So the idea here is that, okay, well, um, what is the source of our actions? Well, it's us, right? And so that means that if we want to change our actions, right, then we need to change our hearts, our characters, our desires, right? And so this is a moral theory that's focused on assessing moral situations based on the person's character, right? We could say he's a good guy or she's a bad gal, right? We make these kinds of assessments all the time. And so we're going to look at virtue ethics as a kind of example of character-based moral reasoning. And so we'll turn to Aristotle for an example of an account of virtue ethics. Let's see. Okay. All right. So we are, like I said a second ago, we are shifting our focus from character or from actions themselves to character. So, for example, um, in I'm blanking on this fellow's name, but Hills. This is a great article. Um, his his uh, his article, "Ideals of Human Excellence in Preserving Nature." His name's Tom Hill. Just came back to me. Tom Hill's article is a discussion of environmental ethics, but he notes that it's notoriously difficult to say cutting down a tree or bulldozing a mountain is like wrong in and of itself, right? Who is it that we're wronging, right? We have good outcomes, so it's hard to see why, say, bulldozing a mountain or blowing up a mountain range is wrong per se, right? Um, Rather, he says, look, when it comes to environmental ethics, we need to shift our focus to character-based reasoning, right? What kind of person would blow up a beautiful mountain range that took millions of years to come into existence, right? When we start asking those questions, then we can see the moral rightness or the moral wrongness of issues about environmental ethics. So this is one example of a place uh, where virtue theory or character-based ethics can be really helpful and really insightful for examining the morality of a certain situation. Okay, so virtue ethics broadly asks, okay, let's imagine an ideally virtuous person. What are the kinds of things that that person would do? Um, would that person help other people, right? And so we say, okay, what things that the ideally virtuous person would do are things that we are in some way obligated to do. So presumably we all want to model ourselves after the ideally virtuous person, right? Um, so we ask, well, what would that person do? What would they do all the time? What would they do sometimes? And what would they never do? And in that way, we can kind of get a sense of the kinds of things that we need to do all the time, the kinds of things that we can do some of the time, and the kinds of things that we can never, ever, ever do, right? Um, so our obligations in some way track what this ideally virtuous person would do. So, for example, could the ideally virtuous person have an abortion, right? So this is a major question in the abortion debate, right? So we can give arguments that say, look, the ideally virtuous person would not have an abortion, or the ideally virtuous person would always have an abortion if they wanted to, or the ideally virtuous person in some circumstances could have an abortion. And how we answer those questions is going to affect how we think about the character related aspects of the abortion topic. Okay, so here we see some candidates for virtuous people, right? So Confucius, Rosa Parks, MLK, and Malala, and so these individuals all seem to have shared in the ideally virtuous person's behaviors, right? But they are not themselves ideally virtuous people. And so we turn to we can look to these people for certain aspects of virtue, but we have to think about the ideally virtuous person because these people are flawed just like all of us, right? And so that means that we can't look to them for all of our behaviors. Okay, so we're going to turn now to Aristotle as an example of virtue ethics and as an example of character-based moral reasoning. Okay, so the idea here is that human beings are special in some way. We can model our behaviors in relevant ways through habituation. So, other natural objects, rocks, fire, all of these things, no matter how many times you throw a rock in the air, it's always just going to come back down, right? You can't habituate a rock to just keep going into the air forever and ever and ever. Like things don't work that way. However, you can habituate human character, right? You can habituate our sense of morality, our own habits, right? And in that way, we are in some sense distinct from all of these other things. Now, the major claim here is that nobody is virtuous by birth, right? Nobody's just naturally virtuous, right? Rather, we are virtuous only by habituation, right? So we have to know what the virtues are, and then we have to behave in ways that incline us to do the virtuous thing at the right time, right? Doing the right thing at the right time. That's something that we have to practice, just like anything else, right? Nobody's born a mechanic. Nobody is born a boat builder. Nobody's born a musician. All of these things require lots and lots and lots of practice. And so the idea here is that morality is the same exact way. Morality is, in some sense, has to be practiced. Virtues have to be practiced. If they're not practiced, then they're going to fall into vices, right? If you don't floss your teeth, you get cavities. If you don't practice virtue, you're going to be vicious. You're going to be, or you're going to be a person with vices, which is bad. Nobody wants that. Okay, so here's a question. How do we determine whether a thing is a virtue and another thing is a vice, right? So why is it a virtue to be generous? And why is it a vice to be greedy, right? Why isn't the virtue to be greedy and the vice to be generous? Similarly, why is courage the vice or the virtue? And why is cowardliness or rashness the vices? Why are those things the vices? Well, we don't just get to pick, right? Morality, we saw in moral relativism, right? We do just get to pick according to moral relativism. However, Aristotle gives an objective account for how we can determine which character traits are virtues and which character traits are vices. And he points to human function and human flourishing. Okay, so what's the function of a human being? Or before we ask that, what's a function, right? Okay, a function is what a thing is for, right? My eyeball is for seeing stuff, right? It just has a function. My heart is for pumping blood, right, back and forth through my body. My iPhone is for doing all sorts of functions, right? Whereas if something stops performing those functions, we would say that it in some sense is defective or deficient or broken, right? Okay, so there are virtues to each of these things, right? So let's use just a more down to earth example, like a hammer, right? What's the function of a hammer? To hit nails into walls and onto surfaces, right? Okay, um, imagine a hammer that doesn't have the metal head, right? Not much of a hammer. You're not going to do very much hammering with a wooden stick, right? That would be a hammer that has, in some sense, failed to perform its function, right? Similarly, this iPhone could not hammer in a nail, right? It's just not the right kind of tool, right? So the function of hammering stuff is, or at least is limited to hammering type things, right? Things like hammers or mallets, right? So, and things like making phone calls and sending texts fall within the function of an iPhone, right? Um, and so the idea here is that the function of a thing is kind of the end that it's designed um, to achieve, right? Okay, so humans, according to Aristotle, have a function, right? And in order to find that function, he turns to three aspects of human life, or three different kinds of human life. So we can look at the hedonistic life, right? The life where we pursue pleasure and stay away from pain. The life of, merriment and enjoyment. Um, the function there is pleasure in a relevant way. We could look at the political life, the life of creating relationships, doing favors for one another, gaining power and honor, right? There might be a set of virtues that help fulfill the function of that kind of life. Similarly, we can look at the contemplative life, right? The life of thinking about things, the life of reflection, the life, what Aristotle actually calls the good life, right? There are virtues associated with the contemplative life as well, right? And so these are three candidates for what for what humans are for, right? Um, and so Aristotle wants to say that that the end of human life is actually the contemplative life. And so virtues, as a consequence, help get us towards that end. Okay, so we have humans with a function, right? We achieve that function with virtues, right? In the same way that the hammer has a function to hammer in nails, right? And it has hammer-like virtues, namely being hard enough and being like shaped well enough to actually hammer in a nail, right? Being aerodynamic and all of these things, right? These are all what we might call hammery virtues, right? That sounds stupid, I know, but hammery virtues. In a similar way, there are humany virtues as well that help us achieve the end of the human life. Okay, so we already know that virtues are habituated, right? So we practice them. We have to repeat certain behaviors. They're not just inclinations, right? They're not just feelings. They are things that are refined after a very long time, kind of like a musician, right? So and they help us perform our function. So it might be helpful to look at an analogy here. So this is a Tennessee football game, and this is the kicker, right? There was a big football game, right, a while back where Tennessee kicked the field goal and won the game. It was great. Wish I could have seen it, but it was awesome. But it's a helpful analogy, right? So think about a kicker, football kicker. The kicker has a function. What is it? To kick the football through the field goal, right? Pretty clear function. Okay, they fulfill that function by doing what? Practice and repetition, right? They do this all the time. They do the same thing every time. And so think about like when you see a kicker, they kind of do this thing where they stand by the ball and then they walk back and they walk to the side and they kind of do their arm like that and then they kick the ball, right? Um, so they do that every time, not because it just makes them kick the field goal in, but it's a kind of ritual, right? It's kind of thing that they do every time they kick the ball in order to kick the ball well, right? So it's a kind of habituated ritual that helps them get into the mindset of kicking the ball. Okay, similarly, we have um, a kind of repeated process that helps us act virtuously, right? Um, okay, there's another point here. So we can think about the kicker example. The other thing that we can talk about though is the vices. So what is a vice, right? Okay, we might ask, is the vice the opposite of a virtue? Well, no, according to Aristotle. According to Aristotle, every virtue is the mean between two vices, right? So we can think about this as kind of a scale. We can have vices of deficiency and vices of excess, right? So here's a list of virtues and vices. Uh, see how many that you have. So let's look at courage, right? So courage is in between two vices, namely cowardice or cowardliness, right? Which is the vice of deficiency or having too little courage, right? But we also might say that you can possibly have too much courage, right? You can be rash. You can make poor decisions, right, that end up getting you killed because you just somehow think that you're invincible, right? So the brave or the courageous person is going to be sometimes afraid, right? And sometimes they will be a little rash too. And so it's all about balancing where it's good to be a little bit afraid or where it's good to be a little bit rash, right? But not being too afraid all the time and not being too rash all of the time either. Rather, given the situation, right, the courageous person will either be more afraid or more rash, right? So we can look see this little cartoon here, right? Uh, you see this one guy, he's running in, he's saying charge, and he's charging into a whole army of people, right? We would say that this guy is a little deficient, right? That's funny. But we would say that this guy's rash, right? This guy should be afraid to run into an army. That's the idea, right? So in order to be courageous, that guy needs to be a little bit more afraid. Okay, and so you won't have to know all of these vices and virtues. They're just there to be for helpfulness, right? But you can look at all of these different, about how they kind of all work, right? How, generous, but you can be too generous and be wasteful, or you could be ungenerous, right? You can be greedy. And that's just kind of how all of these virtues and vices work, according to Aristotle. Okay, and this is a helpful map for everything that we've covered in the last 3 lectures. Um, this is sort of what we're looking at, like what's the moral theory, like what's the example of the moral theory. So, for example, we did virtue ethics today, and we looked at Aristotelianism or Aristotle as an example of virtue ethics. Similar way, we looked at Kant and Kantian ethics for deontological for deontological ethics, rule-based ethics. And you can just see that they all have different starting points and they all have different questions, right? So this will be helpful for you for navigating these 3 different moral theories. We'll think more about them as we continue through the course. So we're about to start doing more applied issues. So things like environmental ethics, things like abortion, things like the moral status of animals and future people, right? So we're going to wonder about who has moral status coming up. So we can, when we look at all of these applied articles, right, and these applied topics, we can ask, is the author looking at this through a virtue ethics lens, through a consequentialist lens, a deontological lens, right? What what how is it that the author's thinking? And we can kind of broadly categorize many of these authors into different um, topics, right? Into different moral theories. So we can kind of think about the moral theory and think about how these authors are influenced by the moral theories that they're talking about. Um, okay, so I'm going to end it here today. Email me if you have questions. I'm more than happy to help. All right, thanks.